Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of Compassion and Courage, Conversations in Healthcare. This is the podcast where we teach compassionate communication, provide perspective, and inspire resilience. I'm your host, Marcus Engel, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing a good friend of mine, MJ Murray-Vachon. MJ, thank you so much for joining me on the program today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here with you.
So I want to make sure that everybody gets all of your letters and such like that right. You're a LCSW, right?
Yep.
Licensed clinical social worker,
Yep.
and an LMFT, which is
A licensed marriage and family therapist.
right. So I love that on the Inner Challenge podcast, your podcast, that you really delve into those things that keep a lot of us who are on the other side of the couch, so to speak, from counselors in mind that really help us. So thank you for your podcast. Thank you for your work. 44,000 hours of clinical work, right?
And counting.
Sitting and counting with individuals, families, couples, etc.
Yep.
Helping people. How? For those who have maybe never sat in a room with a therapist, how do you even start when you start making a relationship with a client or a patient?
I think I start with the first phone call. One of the things I do just as a practice is I try to get back to people the day they call, because people call therapists when they're in distress. Even if I don't have openings, I call them back. I help them try to find someone. But when people come into the office, and to be pretty clear, when people come into the office, I try to be really specific about where they can park, how to get in the hallway, what my waiting room color is, because I know people are really nervous to begin therapy. And then they sit in the office, and I just don't do a traditional intake like probably many therapists do, because I feel like that's coming from a point of the information I need. I just really say, what brings you here? And I let them start with where they're at. And I've learned how to do that intake really in the first 2 or 3 sessions combined, without it feeling like an intake where I have paper and pen and I'm writing about them when they really are very distressed about something else.
That's beautiful, right? You're being a thoughtful, intentional approach, because you know that these people are already hurting before they ever even pick up the phone to dial and ask for help. I love that. And so how did you always know that you were going to be a therapist, and has this always been your driving passion, or how did you decide to take this route for your career?
Well, I'm 62, so the idea of being a therapist wasn't even in the stratosphere when I was an adolescent. And when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a vet because I like dogs, but I don't like blood. So that fell to the wayside. But I really always thought I would be an attorney. My father was an attorney. I had a great affection for him. I like to argue. I'm great with words. It just seemed like a good fit. And post college, I did a year of volunteer work. And I had a acceptance to law school that I was able to defer. And I really began to think about, I would be a really good attorney because I like to argue, but I didn't think being an attorney would be that good for me. I think it's not necessarily a good thing to take your best quality and make it even worse when it's arguing. So I began to really think about what else I could do, and just fell into being a therapist. I was working at a job, and there was this course at our local college that was kind of a get to know yourself course. And that really led me into considering being a therapist.
So you're a kid growing up, and you want to be a vet, you want to be an attorney, you end up in therapy at a time when therapy was almost, I don't want to say unheard of, but certainly didn't have the prevalence in a greater society that we see today, and the emphasis on mental health.
Yeah, it was, there was a lot of stereotyping. And I think it's fair to say that when I was in this course, unbeknownst to me, there were about 125 people in the course, and they chose 24 people for their master's in counseling program. And I was chosen. I did not know that that was an option. So when I got this letter, I went to my advisor and I said, or I guess he was my professor at the time. I said, "Oh, there's a mistake. I didn't even sign up to be considered, and I'm going to law school." And he said, "Oh, let's talk about it." And we talked about it. And he said, "I think you really have what it takes to be a really good therapist. Why don't you try it for a semester? And if you like it, then you can continue." And I said, "I'll make a deal with you. I'll try it for a semester if you add one more person, because I don't want to take someone's spot, because most likely I'll drop out." But after about 3 weeks, I was like, ooh, I had been a fairly good student, and I had not ever really studied anything I loved. I had studied business undergrad. So it all seemed super easy and interesting to me.
And to say that you are a therapist is really not a full picture, because you have written curriculum, you have taught curriculum outside of the traditional setting of uh, sitting on couches with doing cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So can you share a little bit about how you got inspired to move out of that one-on-one type of session into some of the other ventures that you take in?
Yeah, I really wear two hats. I'm a clinical social worker, and my other hat is I'm really a mental wellness educator. I have a program that's about 30 years old called Inner Challenge. And I started Inner Challenge because my first 7 years of being a therapist, I worked in really, really challenging areas, primarily sexual and physical abuse. And 6 of those years, I did in home therapy in Chicago, primarily in the low income neighborhoods, what people would call the ghetto. So then we moved back to South Bend. My husband got a job at Notre Dame. And I thought, wow, this is going to be pretty easy after working with the families that I worked with that I absolutely loved. I think of all the work I've ever done, the in home therapy was my favorite. And I was shocked to find, because at that time I was specializing a lot in adolescents and college students, I was shocked to see how off the developmental track many of them were. And I began to think about what would it be like if we had more education for teens about adolescence. And I sought and looked for a program and didn't find one. And so my closest friend and my closest colleague and I created a girls' camp called Camp 2000. That was really the beginning of Inner Challenge. And that was to teach what we called in those days life skills and character development.
And that curriculum that you created is still in use.
Yes, well, that was the beginning of it. That we were fortunate. Some parents from the camp asked us to bring the curriculum to a junior high, and it was at the junior high for 20 years. In sixth, seventh, and eighth grade, I was there on Mondays and Fridays. And it had about 6 iterations because it's a field that changes dynamically. We have lots of research now, and we got better and better at figuring out this. The students were my teachers, because junior high students, it either works or it doesn't. They don't give you any pats on the back that are not deserved. And we had a parent program. It also had a sex ed curriculum that I worked on with 3 other women in a local health museum. And then after about 21 years, I just wanted to do something different, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. But I left the school, and through a series of flukes, I ended up being hired by Notre Dame football to create a course for freshman football players at the University of Notre Dame. Did that for 3 years. It was every second of it was joyful and amazing. They were the easiest group of people I've ever worked with, and it was amazing. And then my last iteration, my current iteration, is a podcast, because I deeply want to get this material out to people for free. The good news is people on my waiting list can listen to the first 13 episodes that are the fundamentals of mental wellness and not be frustrated being on my waiting list. And that was my real motivation for it. But now I've got the second season, which is a mental wellness coaching.
And I just want to again give kudos to the Inner Challenge podcast, because I have been going through the modules and learning a lot. So thank you for putting that out there for people like me who, I guess I'm like a lot of counseling or therapy clients or patients that I'll go for a while and then stop for a while and then try to pick up again. But that podcast standing there is something that I can always tap back into. So thank you again for creating that and making that a resource for the rest of us.
You're welcome. I feel really good about it. And I think one of the unfortunate parts of being a therapist is that there's no degree program in the country that integrates clinical work and mental wellness information, education. So most therapists don't have a lot that is on that. I mean, there was a study done, I think around 2010, 2012, and most therapists don't have a definition of mental wellness, which I think is unfortunate because then people don't really know what they're working towards. And I've seen in my own work, as I've gotten clearer and clearer, and as I've developed the curriculum, that it just really allows my clients to have words for what they're going through, but also to move through things at a quicker pace, which I think people want to feel better as fast as they can.
Sure. So let's get down to that then. The nuts and bolts of mental wellness. What's your definition, and how do you suggest people start by getting their definition and having that for a goal or a success measure, I suppose.
The definition I use is a combination of two: the World Health Organization, that says that we're mentally well when we can basically use our abilities for the benefit of our families, our communities, our schools, and that we can manage through normal life experiences. I don't think there's anything earth shaking about that. And I think when people hear it, they're like, oh, yeah. So I often say that in Inner Challenge, I'm usually not teaching anyone anything new. I'm actually putting words to things that they intuitively know. And the second image I use, which is my primary definition, is Dr. Dan Siegel, a neuropsychiatrist, Harvard educated, out of California. And he calls it the river of integration. And I've adapted it. I call it the river of wellness. And so if you can imagine in your mind a peaceful river, and that is really the natural state of our mind, where our mind is peaceful, it's clear, it's alert, and it's happy. And for most Americans, that is something they don't truly believe. We've gotten to a point in our culture where people believe that anxiety and not having mental clarity is normal and there's not much we can do about it. But that is not part of my definition, because that isn't mental wellness. And Siegel's image is the blue river, where we're kind of floating in it. We're peaceful and calm. And one bank is rigidity, where we're trying to impose control over something. And another bank is chaos, where we're out of control about something. And most of us can relate to the reality that we walk through the day and we might feel like, oh, it's pretty good, feeling pretty peaceful. And then something typically unexpected happens, and we can get on either of those banks very quickly. And the goal of mental wellness is to have the self-awareness to realize when our mental state goes. And the skill of mental wellness is to be able to bring it back into the river. And Siegel gives us this acronym, FACES, that we often bring it back into the river by being flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. And what I often use as an example of this is something that most of us experience every week, if not every day, just how impatient we get when we have to wait for something. And we can feel ourselves internally getting agitated, which is either a form of chaos, depending on your experience, or maybe rigidity, where you fall into that pattern of blame. Like, they should be going faster. What's wrong with them? They're understaffed. This is ridiculous. But both of those are ways that our mental state loses its calm, loses its peacefulness. And the coherence is to begin to look at the situation in a way that's realistic. Because of the pandemic, most of us live now in a culture where there's just not enough people working. And we have to say to ourselves, wait, everybody's understaffed. This isn't personal. And that's coherent, where our inside and our outside matches. And that asks us to be flexible and adaptive. And that means that, wait, maybe I don't have time to wait and I need to move on. Maybe I could be adaptive. I could sit and start on my emails, and that would be using this time, which is going to be longer than I had hoped for, in a constructive way. And when we do those, we usually feel more stable and more peaceful. So in a nutshell, that's my definition.
Yeah. So again, that image, we've got the river flowing along. We've got rigidity on one side. We've got chaos on the other side. We want to stay in the middle of the river through the use of faces, which was flexibility. I don't remember A or CES.
Yeah, adaptive, coherence. And coherence is just that you got to make things make sense. Energized and stable.
Energized and stable. Wow. That is, I love the visual imagery of that, and to be able to put myself in that middle. I guess I would think of myself as often steering towards rigidity. That's the bank that I have to come off of more than chaos. And is there anything special that you would suggest for people like myself who find themselves on the side of rigidity rather than chaos? Is there anything special that we can do with that acronym of FACES that will help us get back in the middle of the river?
Well, most people, in my experience, but this isn't research-based, but clinical observation, lean towards one side more than the other. Mm-hmm. So for people who lean towards rigidity, the awareness that, when things aren't going my way, I can tend to try to impose control, typically to get them to go my way. So awareness is the first step. Breath work is the second. When we get rigid, we tend to hold our breath. And then we tend to not breathe, and that makes us feel even more distressed. So I encourage people, watch for when you're kind of clenching, watch for when you're trying to impose control, and breathe and allow yourself to be a bit calmer. And when we do a few breaths, often people can think more clearly. And that's where the coherence, that's where the thought work comes in. That I'm very, very body-based. I'm very emotions before thought. So I think my style differs a lot from what is often talked about in our culture. Control your thoughts to change your emotions. I am like, start with your emotions. Take a breath. If they're really intense, put your hand wherever they're at on your body, take some breath work. And then most people will have more clarity of thought. And one of the things I didn't say in my definition is that mental wellness starts in our mind. And it isn't, our hamstring, it's not our stomach, it's our mental state. And that might seem obvious, but that has been one thing that my evaluations from workshops and working with students has been a consistent piece of feedback where young people or adults have said to me, I never really thought that mental wellness had anything to do with my mind. And so we have to pay attention to our mind.
Our mind can, nobody really understands how our minds bounce around until they truly try to focus on one thing, right? When we talk about breath work and meditation, mindfulness exercises, that is so overwhelming and intimidating to people because we're such a society of instant gratification, right? As you said earlier, we want to move through something fast. And we see our monkey mind bouncing all over and think, oh, I can't do this. I can't sit here and breathe and relax into my body. And it is hard at first, but as an experienced meditator, that breath work, it's so beneficial. It right. Takes practice, but it's so beneficial.
The hardest skill I have with my clients is to consistently encourage them to keep at meditation. And I will be honest, my success rate is very low, very, very low. The people who do keep at it are the people who have the most healing, have the most amount of mental wellness. There's just no doubt in my mind. But one of the things that's difficult is people often for the first time observe how busy their mind is. Their mind isn't doing anything different. Like when we start to meditate, our mind is doing what it's always done. We're different. We're observing it. And we don't understand. And I think the best piece of research has come out in the last year is that the value of meditation is not being able to hold the single point in meditating, maybe the word or your breath work, but it's bringing our mind back once it drifts. And I try to say to people, your mind will run away. That's what minds do. Bringing it back is as important as if you were someone who had the skill of the Dalai Lama, who I assume brings it back a hell of a lot less than me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm in a meditation group with a Buddhist monk, and he talks all the time about how his mind goes off. And he's a Buddhist monk. So it gives me a lot of permission to let it go off and bring it back.
And what just an overall philosophy for life too, right?
Yes.
To let it go and try to come back into this moment. I think about Disney did a really great job with Frozen by engraving "Let It Go" into the minds of a whole new generation, but just overall, that's what we need to do, right? That's what we need to do. And in my experiences of going through therapy and counseling, so much of it is just letting it go, letting those things go that we cannot control, and that consistently just bring us unhappiness or unfulfillment. So in your work as a therapist, obviously, whenever we think of someone sitting down with a counselor or a therapist, we expect a empathetic response to our problems, right? Those of us sitting on the other side of the desk or the couch, we expect an empathetic or a compassionate response to what we're saying and the issues that we're bringing up. Do you ever feel challenged to show compassion or to feel compassion with patients?
Of course, at times I do, but not very often, because I think I don't start from the place of compassion, which might not be great for your podcast. Mm-hmm. I think I start from the place of fascination, that I find people so interesting, and I'm really curious about what they bring to me and what they want. And out of that gives me a big picture of why they are in the dilemma that they're in. That while many people come to therapy for things that have happened to them, equally, people come to therapy for things that they've done to themselves. And either of those are fascinating. And so I don't lack compassion often, because I think I form a pretty deep understanding of the person in my office. I really have liked all my clients except one in 36 years.
I won't even ask you about that one client in 36 years.
Yeah, no, practice. I mean, he was a sociopath. You can ask mm-hmm. me. It was an in-home therapy session, in Chicago, and every time I left, he beat the shit out of his child.
Oh my goodness!
And I had to keep going. As people probably know, the Department of Children and Family Services in every city is overloaded and broken, and it was just a terrible situation. And
so how do you deal? How do you deal then? How do you walk away from that, knowing that the system is what's in control of this person's suffering, and you can't control the system?
I was young. Yeah. There were no cell phones. It took a long time to get back to the office, and I could do nothing but sit with the violence that I heard, because of course I knocked on the door. I tried to get in, and he's beating his child, and the child is screaming in an apartment complex where that wasn't unusual. So it wasn't like it alerted the neighbors. And I had to just sit for a long time on the L. And I remember feeling nauseous and wanting to cry, but not wanting to cry on the L. And then walking to my office and going into my supervisor's office, who was just a real take charge, I'm going to fix the world kind of woman. And she called the police, which I felt bad. I didn't even think about calling the police. I didn't have a way to call the police. Mm-hmm. So, and that I was around a lot of violence in those years, and I grew up not exposed to any violence. So it was all a learning, and it made me learn quickly. I often take comfort in the line from the Bible that says the poor will always be with us, that I can't fix everything. And I am a fixer. My husband said to me last night, "You're a compassionate fixer." And it's always been something I've been working on, to let go of my need to fix, and to be just present and more compassionate, and let it unfold in its own terms, not mine.
I think I've shared with you that specifically with you, and by the way, your husband Dominic is my co-instructor through the Pathos Project course at Notre Dame, which has also introduced me to you and your work, which has very much benefited my life. So I could hear him saying that you're a compassionate fixer.
Yeah.
And one of the first assignments that the students in the course have every semester is a question that I would have for you. And that is, if there has been a time that, if you can recount a time that you have been shown compassion, or you have shown another compassion, the time that someone has been there for you, or that you have been there for someone else. That's what I give to the students every semester for their first reflection. And I'd love to see if you could share a time that you have felt compassion or been the person giving compassion.
I was given this question ahead of time, just so your viewers know, because I'm going to probably sound more articulate than one would imagine, because I've thought about this a lot. And of course, I'm a therapist. I have many, many examples. And if you're a good therapist, you are always in and out of therapy yourself. So I have lots of therapists who have shown me compassion. But the example I'm going to show is really an example of when I had self-compassion for myself. I was fortunate enough. I was raised in a loving, stable family, and in a community and in a school system where I think the values were very shared and clear. And those values were: be nice, do good things, and contribute to the world. So that is a luxury. And I think in the example I want to share was when I think that set of values really matured. So I'm cooking dinner. This is about 25 years ago. I'm cooking dinner, and my daughter is at the table doing her homework, and my husband is helping her. Our daughter had trouble in school, and we were in the very frustrating stage, for any of you who are listeners out there who have kids with learning differences, of trying to figure out, like, what is going on here. And my husband has infinite patience, which I have now, but I did not have it at the time. And he was trying to help her learn a concept, and she could not get it. And she was becoming more and more frustrated, more and more sad. And I'm cooking probably chicken soup or something, and I'm not part of this at all, but observing it. And I am completely triggered inside. I am irritated and I am angry, and I am white knuckling it to keep my mouth shut and to do nothing. A couple weeks later, I happened to be going through a training for EMDR, which is a therapy tool that therapists use. This is in the late 90s. It was quite new at the time. And part of the training asked us to think of a time that we were triggered. And I chose that event. And I'm not going to get into the details of the protocol of EMDR, but part of it is you are led to float back to different memories. And as I went through the process, very much to my surprise, I floated back to when I was 5 years old, and I had a very severe speech impediment. So from the time I was 3 to the time I was 8, I was in speech therapy 2-3 times a week. And the memory I had was trying to talk to this man and explain to him where I lived, because I had gotten lost and he could not understand me. And in my head, I was so clear. I lived at 16409 Brick Road, blah, blah, blah. I told him the color of my house, and his face was so confused. And I had not thought of that forever. And as I looked at myself through this process of EMDR, my irritation melted into compassion for how hard that was for me. And as the process continued, I remembered Linda Lambert, my speech teacher, who was this beautiful woman in her mid 20s, who I spent time with every week. And I remembered her patience and her creativity and all the things she did to help this kid who had this terrible stutter, who had this terrible speech impediment, learn to speak so people could understand her. And as the EMDR went on, I then remembered my mother, who had 6 children. I was number 5. And I just had such gratitude for her wisdom of taking the time and the resources to really allow me to heal from something that wasn't my fault, that if it had not been treated would have changed the course of my life. And I look back at that little episode 25 years later as really maturing the values I had to be a person that was good, to use my abilities and talents for the benefit of others, to really being a compassionate person who began to train my mind and to really understand that compassion isn't enough. What I had to integrate was wisdom. That what my mother was very wise. She was wise, and she knew that if you had to take a kid out of the neighborhood who loved to play 3 times a week, you better pair her with somebody she loved, and it better be pretty fun. And I remember thinking, this is my call for my daughter, who I knew had something wrong with her, that I needed to find people that she would love. And I needed to not let my selfishness or my fear of the expense of it all, it was all very expensive, drive it. And so the example I'm giving is really when I left like the idea of serving others to the idea of really making my heart be compassionate and trying to be wise with that compassion.
What a beautiful story. And that that personal insight is beautifully refreshing and not all that common. I would expect no less from a therapist. I guess I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to, because you and I have talked about EMDR as a therapy. And could you like just explain a little bit about what EMDR is, how it's used, and who would benefit from it the most? Specifically, because we all have something traumatizing in our past.
EMDR is a therapy that was created by a woman, Francine Shapiro. She was a PhD, a doctor. And she came upon it accidentally when she was working with a man who had, I believe, I don't know if it was trauma from war, but a very significant trauma. And she noticed what all of us came to notice. Often when people talk about their trauma, their eyes go back and forth in a rapid way. And she just intuitively, one session, said, could your eyes follow my fingers when you talk about that trauma? And what happened was the emotional intensity of it dissolved. And from that, she began to play around with it. And now, almost 50 years later, it really is the gold standard of trauma treatment. And I don't refer anyone to someone who isn't only EMDR trained, but also uses it extensively, because I feel that it takes the therapist out of therapy, that there's an 8-stage protocol and it's very whole body. You start with an image. So when I did mine, my image was me being at the stove, white knuckling. Then we had to have a negative belief. And my negative belief was, I'm out of control. My positive belief is I can let go of control. I don't need to be in control. And then we went to my body of when you take the negative belief, I'm out of control, with that image of, white knuckling it at the stove. What do you feel? I felt irritated. I felt angry. Much to my surprise, I felt sad because I didn't feel sad making the soup. And then there's this process where you either follow the therapist's index finger and middle finger, or you hold these tappers that provide bilateral stimulation, or you might use a light that bilaterally goes back and forth. And you do these sets. and it's free association. So it's just this, you're connected to your inner world and it takes you where it is meant to take you. So in my case, I could have sat and talked about it and been in my head the whole time. But what EMDR does is you have the image, you have the sensation of where on your body do you feel the irritation, the anger, the sadness. You have the thought, I'm out of control. And then you have the feeling. And that's why I say it's whole body. And the mind goes where it goes. And I would never have been able to resolve that situation. And the next time I saw her, I wasn't triggered. And why is that important? Because how do you help someone long term with a learning difference if you're triggered all the time? And so one of the things it taught me is that I have to be aware of what's going on in me that takes me away from what I call my mental aspirations. I mentally want to be compassionate. I mentally want to be wise. And when I'm not, compassion and wisdom are in the river. And when I get on the banks, as I do on most days, then I become curious to figure out what's going on in me and try to dissolve it, not fix it, but try to get back to that compassionate place with whatever the challenge is in front of me.
I hope that listeners will, if you haven't heard of EMDR, you will look into that and maybe check it out a little bit, because we are all carrying around some kind of trauma, whether it's something as profound as what I went through with as much loss, or it's something that may seem rather minor in the overall scheme of things. Yeah, please look into that. And thank you for sharing that with
I should add that it is no longer just used for trauma. It is used pretty much across the board for lots of different things. When I taught the Notre Dame football players, some of them were using it in sports psychology. So as many really excellent tools, its use has been broadened. And I think it's been broadened in not like I feel like sometimes in our culture, someone has a good idea and then it's being applied to everything. I think EMDRIA, which is a national association, is very conscious about the research, about the broadening use of it. So it's not just for trauma anymore. It's also just to resolve challenges.
Yeah. Whatever hangups that
Yeah.
we've picked up throughout life. MJ, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing this knowledge and wisdom and insight with me. In the time we have left, can I shoot a couple of rapid fire questions past you? Okay.
Sure.
So, you talked a little bit earlier about some of your young days being in Chicago and practicing and such. I'd like to go back to a little bit before that, to when you're 16 years old and you're hanging out with your girlfriends after school or after sports practice, after school job, whatever it is. What's on the radio? What are you listening to when you're 16?
I am not a music person. I'm probably not listening to anything. I'm a words person. I'm a reader. So I can remember songs from Chicago, but it's always been one of the things I wished I liked music more. But I think that I was a person, I talk a lot. I have friends who talk a lot. So I like silence. And because words fill up my days, I don't typically put too much music in the rest of my life.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And I first came to love music specifically because of the words, the poetry of Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash and Chris Christopherson, those types of singer-songwriters. Those are the words were, because anybody can play a three-chord guitar song, but it's the poetic lyrics that always drew me in. So well, then that brings up another question. Let's say that you are exiled, so to speak, to the proverbial deserted island, but it's a well-appointed deserted island, and you get to keep one piece of art with you, whether that is a book, a painting, a sculpture, a Broadway play, or a Netflix series. What is a piece of art that really speaks to you, that inspires you?
I think I would bring a book. One of the profound impacts in my life the last 10 years has really being educated about Buddhism. And there's a really simple book called How to Transform Your Life. It's in the Kadampa school of Buddhism that I would probably take, because if I was exiled to an island, that would be an adverse condition. And I would have to do a lot of mind work to be happy. And we have great examples of Nelson Mandela, uh, Viktor Frankl, who were exiled and they were able to be happy. And that would be, I would probably take that book because I would really need that book.
Nice. Nice. I'm going to have to put that on my reading list. Tell me again the
How to
title.
Transform Your Life.
How to Transform Your Life. Okay. I'm going to have to check that out. And then lastly, let's say that you have the biggest billboard, the biggest, brightest billboard on the highest mountain on earth. What is the message that you broadcast to humanity?
Please put your phone down.
Yeah.
I am deeply concerned by the profound changes that we're not even aware of, admitting, and how we have sacrificed relationships, family life, our ability at work to be able to scroll on the phone.
Yeah. 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 Wow. I'm going to take that to heart and try to be more mindful about my phone usage. I worry about that as well a lot, just philosophically. How do we ever start to imagine things if we never, as kids, have to imagine anything when everything comes across the screen?
I heard an incredible concept yesterday by Scott Galloway, who's a professor at NYU. He talks about the attention economy, that what we are now doing for the sake of money is we are stealing, not really, but for lack of a better word, people's attention. And we're not admitting the cost to that. That I am, I think the two biggest thieves of attention, one is the phone, and the second is pretending that pot doesn't have costs. I'm not against pot. I'm glad it's legalized. We did not do any kind of education. And so the combination, people say to me, oh, I have all these people that they're not good workers. They're not attentive. I think it's really this combination that we're not admitting, that the phone pulls us away. It's perfectly, this is science. This isn't my opinion. It is perfectly synced up to our brain. When I was working with Notre Dame football, their trainer explained to me that no, I did not have this special connection with my children, that when they called on the phone, I magically picked it up and there was one. It's that when a call comes in, it sends a signal to our brain and it interrupts us and we pick up our phone. I've asked over 2,000 people, have you ever lost your phone forever? Not counting if it fell over a boat in a pool of water.
Mm-hmm.
I have never had anyone say yes. That is, to me, the biggest demonstrator that this phone is controlling us. And we have to come up with a plan to manage the phone. I love the phone as much as everyone else. It's a tool. The car is a tool, but it's not running us. We're driving it. And it's the same thing with pot, that I work with lots of people who they use pot 5, 6, 7 hours a day, or 5, 6, 7 times a day, not for medical reasons. I work with people who have had great benefits with medical marijuana, but they use it. And at first it's pretty harmless, but year 4, year 5, their motivation is gone. Their memory isn't what it used to be. And I really, I was at a hospital this weekend and I could just pick out the people who were using pot 2 and 3 times a day by just how sluggish they were, how lethargic they were. They just don't have any light in their eyes. And those two things, I think, really get in the way of us connecting as humans. And if we're not connecting as humans, we're not going to be compassionate. And we're living in a culture that's really into judging. And it's, the antidote for judgment is curiosity. And the consequence of curiosity is compassion.
Profound words. Thank you. Thank you. MJ Murray-Vachon, thank you so much for being with me today. And thank you for enlightening me. Thank you for helping me better understand myself and hopefully clean up some of those things that we pick up mentally over a lifetime of experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for letting me be on my little soapbox the last 2 minutes.
Sure, absolutely.
I know you said one message, but I threw the other one in.
That's right.
I should have said, put down your phone and your bong. So.
That would be a great billboard right there. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining me for today's episode of Compassion and Courage Conversations in Healthcare. I'm your host, Marcus Engel, and this is a podcast that teaches compassionate communication, provides perspective, and inspires resilience.